You are watching the World 24/7 on the NDTV network. I'm Parmeshwar Bava. Let's begin with the top stories you need to know. South Korea's leader lifted martial law just hours after imposing it, but criticism of Yoon appears to be growing after South Korea's president reversed the earlier martial law decree, and Park Chan-dae, a top figure in the Democratic Party, has called on the president to quit. Israel has threatened to return to war in Lebanon if its truce with Hezbollah collapses, and said this time its attacks would go deeper and target the Lebanese state itself after the deadliest day since a ceasefire was agreed last week. 4 Chinese tech and auto industry bodies called on their members to be wary of US chips and buy locally instead in Beijing's latest retaliation over Washington's restrictions. Nepal and China have signed a 9-point agreement as Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli met President Xi Jinping in Beijing, when the two leaders discussed connectivity, industrial development, infrastructural development, and trade and tourism, among other issues. Amazon's cloud computing arm says it's planning to build a massive supercomputer dedicated to artificial intelligence development. The so-called Ultra Cluster will be made up of hundreds of thousands of Amazon Web Services Trainium chips, as well as a new server. Uber is expanding its shared bus service in India, hoping to offer a respite to commuters in a country with some of the world's worst traffic. Well, a big focus. South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol announced plans to lift martial law in the country just hours after declaring it, a surprise move that had sparked a political uproar. After Yoon declared martial law at 11 p.m. local time, 190 members of parliament voted unanimously in favor of lifting it just 2 hours later. But at the time, Yoon said the move was aimed at eradicating pro-North Korean forces and to protect the constitutional order of freedom. He did not specify what measures would be taken, but Yoon, by the way, has struggled to push his agenda through the opposition-controlled parliament. And in his address, just late on local time midnight, he cited the Democratic Party's rejection of a government budget plan and also a motion to impeach the country's top prosecutor.
바로 국무회의를 통해 국회의 요구를 수용하여 계엄을 해제할 것입니다. 다만 즉시 국무회의를 소집하였지만 새벽인 관계로 아직 의결 정족수가 충족되지 못해서 오는 대로 바로 계엄을 해제하겠습니다.
Well, many are questioning whether President Yoon's declaration of martial law could be seen as a necessary response to national security threats, or whether it could be considered an overreach of executive power. But how exactly does this crisis affect public trust in President Yoon's administration, as well as South Korea's democratic institutions? That's under the scanner at the moment. But just to recap, if you're tuning in, well, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol had announced plans to lift martial law in the country just hours after declaring it, which is a surprise move that had sparked complete political uproar. 190 members of parliament voted unanimously in favor of lifting martial law just 2 hours later. And at the time, Yoon had said that the move was aimed at eradicating pro-North Korean forces and to protect the constitutional order of freedom. However, you must note that he did not specify what measures would actually be taken. We have with us at the moment Bill Gallo, Voice of America's Seoul Bureau Chief. Thanks so much, Bill, for making time for us. Is President Yoon's declaration of martial law being seen as initially a necessary response to national security threats, or now is it being considered an overreach of executive power?
Nearly everyone I have talked to sees this as an overreach of power, and that includes many on the South Korean conservative side of the spectrum. There are early morning editorials in many South Korean papers that are fiercely critical of Yoon. Not all of them are calling for him to step down, but many of them are calling for him to step down. It was not clear exactly why he did this for political reasons or national security reasons. The rationale is a bit confusing. This was a very surprising move. I think a lot of people are very confused that it happened at all. They're perhaps relieved that Yoon has backed down, but he is under a phenomenal amount of criticism this morning here in Seoul and overseas.
Bill, also, how does this entire crisis affect public trust in President Yoon's administration, also in South Korea's democratic institutions as a whole?
Well, President Yoon was always very unpopular. Since taking power 2 years ago, his approval ratings have been exceedingly low. So I think you'll expect to see those remain low. However, now the opposition especially has something to seize on as a reason to seek impeachment.
Right.
In fact, opposition forces are already preparing that step this morning. And the public, it seems to be, at least the early signs, on board with this. Of course, it's very early. This is a very late breaking story, and there are still many developments. But it seems that many people see this as sort of a watershed moment for South Korean politics and for President Yoon.
Well, Bill, thank you so much for joining us with that live update from Seoul. We will, of course, revert to you for regular updates regarding the political uproar that's ensued. But many are questioning whether such measures undermine South Korea's democratic values in the name of preserving them. But we will, of course, revert to Bill for regular updates. With that, let's turn our attention now. Well, Israel has threatened to return to war in Lebanon if its truce with Hezbollah collapses, and said this time its attacks would go deeper and target the Lebanese state itself after the deadliest days since the ceasefire was agreed last week. Now, in its strongest threat since the truce was agreed to end 14 months of war with Hezbollah, Israel said it would hold Lebanon responsible for failing to disarm militants who violate the ceasefire. In other news, Syrian and Russian warplanes have launched concentrated air and missile strikes on the central province of Idlib, killing and wounding dozens of terrorists and destroying their vehicles and weapons, is what the Syrian Defense Ministry has confirmed. And turning our attention now to the neighborhood, well, Bangladesh has summoned Indian High Commissioner Pranay Verma to express concerns about the breach of security at its Assistant High Commission in Agartala on Monday by a group that was protesting against the arrests of Hindu monks. Now, Mr. Verma, in turn, upheld the importance of a broader, multi-dimensional relationship between our two nations, stressing that such ties cannot be reduced to a single issue. But I can inform you that Bangladesh has shut its visa and consular services in Agartala, and the decision has been taken citing security reasons, is what Bangladesh official sources have informed us. And you must also note that there was no lawyer in court for the bail hearing for the Hindu priest, Mr. Brahmachari. My colleague Saurabh Gupta has been tracking the finer details for us. He joins us at the moment. Saurabh, India-Bangladesh discord has escalated clearly?
Absolutely. There's no doubt that this has escalated, and this has become an issue that will require some really deft handling and some, very fine diplomacy to resolve. Because on the one hand, you have the issue of India demanding the process of law, and the process of law being that Chinmay Krishna Das, the Hindu priest, being given a proper trial, access to legal counsel, something that is very basic. Now, we've seen videos of the court complex where there are lawyers, probably belonging to radical groups, who say that anyone who gathers the courage to actually defend Chinmay Krishna Das in court will be beaten up right in the court itself. In such an atmosphere of fear, of threats, how will any lawyer defend him? How will he have the basic right of any individual, that is to have his day in court and defend himself? And that's a question that the Bangladesh authorities need to answer. And that's also a question of security that needs to be raised. Now, there is, of course, persecution of the minority community in Bangladesh. That's come up in the UK Parliament as well. A lot of parliamentarians in the United Kingdom, in Britain have also spoken about it. And this is something that probably will, not only is now in the focus of the neighborhood, but also the world's focus. And like I said, that idea of a peacekeeping force floated by Mamata Banerjee is also now there in the public domain and could be one of the solutions to bring an end to the persecution of minorities. And the Bangladesh government will have to do more to show it's serious about the maintenance of law and order, about due process.
As always, Saurabh, thanks so much for joining us with the latest details. In other news, in his first statement to Parliament since India and China reached an agreement in October on patrolling arrangements in the Depsang Plains and Demchok, which are two friction points along the line of actual control, External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar has said that the conclusion of disengagement has set Delhi-Beijing ties in the direction of some improvement. To quote him, "Recent developments that reflect our continuous diplomatic engagements, I have set our ties in the direction of some improvement," is what he said in a detailed statement in Lok Sabha. Listen in to what Dr. Jaishankar had to say.
The House is aware that our ties have been abnormal since 2020, when peace and tranquility in the border areas were disturbed as a result of Chinese actions. India and China have held talks for multiple decades to resolve the boundary issue. While there is a line of actual control, LAC, it does not have a common understanding in some areas. We remain committed to engaging with China through bilateral discussions to arrive at a fair, reasonable, and mutually acceptable framework for a boundary settlement.
Well, let's turn our attention now to the US. Well, sources have informed us that Nargis Fakhri has not been in touch with her sister Alia Fakhri, who has been arrested on charges of murdering her former boyfriend and his friend in New York. And in fact, they have not been in touch for more than 20 years, is what our sources have indicated. Nargis Fakhri, who is the elder sister of Alia Fakhri, is yet to make an official statement on the case, but their mother has so far denied the charges against her daughter. But according to the Queen's District Attorney, Melinda Katz, Alia Fakhri set a two-story garage on fire when her former boyfriend and his friend were asleep. Natasha Esrani reports from the Jamaica area where this incident took place.
This is a huge borough, and we are right now in Jamaica. And yes, I'm standing in front of the house where the alleged incident took place according to the indictment. I want to explain something about this house. I'll ask my camera person to step back a little bit to show us the house. But the reason you don't see any fire marks on this house is because the incident actually took place behind the house in what they call a detached garage. That garage could only be accessed through this route going in, and that's been blocked right now by NYPD with those wooden planks, because that's where the incident took place. The garage was set on fire, according to the indictment, by Alia Fakhri, really trapping the two people inside, a woman and a man. Now, the man is allegedly her ex-boyfriend, who Alia purportedly was trying to get back in touch with for about a year, and this is being described by the DA's office as trapping two human beings in a raging inferno. And Alia is going to be coming back to court in December 9th to see what happens further in her case. She is facing 4 counts of first-degree murder, 4 counts of second-degree murder, as well as charges on arson. So this is the house. That was the garage at the back. We can't show you the garage because it's blocked off and there's no other access to it. But we do have 2 NYPD police cars that have been here. They've been stationed here for the last few minutes, right to my left, actually. And I did get a chance to speak very briefly to neighbors of Edward Jacobs. And what they said was they knew about the fire. They're very sorry about what happened, but they didn't really want to talk anymore and tell us anything else. They were on their way to work, but we will find out more from the Queen's District Attorney's Office, who you also reached out to for comment, and we will see now what happens next when she appears in court in Queens on December 9th.
Staying with updates from the US, where officials announced expanded curbs to China's access to cutting-edge semiconductors, a last gasp in the Biden administration's years-long effort to counter Beijing's tech progress. Washington restricted exports to 140 China-based companies, limited sales of particular kinds of semiconductors, and imposed stricter rules on the transfer of chip-making tools ahead of Donald Trump's return to the White House. Trump, by the way, has promised to introduce even more restrictions, including levies of up to 60% on all Chinese products. But China is already readying its retaliation to Trump's promised tariffs, with options including restricting the export of key minerals, targeting US companies, and courting some of the US's traditional allies, as per reports. But American businesses in particular could be in for a bumpy ride if China enforces retaliatory measures, is what many analysts have already warned. And US President-elect Donald Trump's pick to lead the Drug Enforcement Administration abruptly withdrew his name from consideration just days after being chosen. Chad Cronister said in a post on X that he made the decision as the gravity of this very important responsibility set in, but didn't cite a reason for his withdrawal other than concluding he wanted to continue in his current role as a sheriff in Florida. Well, news and updates continue in a moment right here on NDTV. Taking a quick break for now. Well, France's minority government looks in its final hours as opposition lawmakers from the left and the far right vowed to topple Prime Minister Michel Barnier's cabinet. In fact, a no-confidence vote is scheduled for today at Parliament in the wake of a divisive budget debate with a great chance of being successful. My colleague Ross Cullen reports from Paris.
Yes, so those no-confidence votes will be taking place on Wednesday afternoon, local time here in Paris, and the Prime Minister is certainly in peril. His government is teetering on the brink of collapse because if enough MPs come together, and the numbers certainly suggest that they will come together, then they can bring down the governments. The left wing and the right wing have both submitted motions of no confidence to Parliament, and they are being processed on Tuesday, and those votes to be taking place on Wednesday. If they vote against the Prime Minister, then Michel Barnier will have to resign. He will submit a letter of resignation to the President, to President Macron, who can then choose to try to find somebody else, or can ask Michel Barnier to stay in post and can reappoint him. All of this is linked to the fact that the government had tried to suggest a budget to Parliament, and then it chose to force that budget legislation through the National Assembly, bypassing MPs. It says the budget is proportionate, it's reasonable, but it couldn't garner enough support among lawmakers to pass it through the National Assembly the regular way, so it chose to use executive powers to send it through the National Assembly. But if you do that, it does open yourself up to the possibility of facing no confidence vote. If Michel Barnier does lose that no confidence vote on Wednesday, he will become the shortest serving Prime Minister in French history, and it'll be the first time a government has lost such a vote since 1962. Ross Cullen, NDTV, Paris.
Now the news. Russian drones struck critical infrastructure in Ukraine's western Ternopil region last night, overnight in fact. The Ukrainian Air Force has said this, and the attack has actually left parts of the city of Ternopil without electricity just a week after Moscow's strikes cut power to much of the city as well as the surrounding region. And this as Ukraine has blasted an agreement struck 30 years ago under which it relinquished nuclear weapons in exchange for security assurances that never materialized, as it makes a concerted push for an invitation to join the NATO alliance. Kyiv is desperately calling for robust security guarantees to protect it from renewed Russian aggression, as Donald Trump's return to the White House raises fears of a rapidly struck settlement to the war that would leave it exposed. In other news, Amazon and artificial intelligence company Anthropic are actually building a massive cluster of computers that dwarfs the processing power used to build current AI models. Amazon's cloud computing arm has said it's planning to build a massive supercomputer dedicated to artificial intelligence development, and the so-called ultra cluster will be made up of hundreds of thousands of Amazon Web Services Trainium chips as well as a new server. Now, this supercomputer is expected to be completed next year and will be one of the largest in the world for training AI models. It will be used by AI startup Anthropic, in which Amazon has invested billions of dollars, and Microsoft is facing a $1.27 billion antitrust lawsuit, by the way, in the United Kingdom over how it charges customers who buy rival cloud software services. Well, switching tracks, on its 61st flight, India's workhorse rocket has been tasked by the European Space Agency to launch a very special pair of satellites that will mimic the total solar eclipse through precision formation flying. The satellites, named Proba 3, will lift off from Sriharikota. My colleague Pallav Bagla spoke exclusively to Professor Dipankar Banerjee, a solar physicist and director of ISRO's Indian Institute of Space Technology in Thiruvananthapuram, to decipher the mission. Listen in.
India is getting ready to launch a satellite for the European Space Agency called the Proba satellite, a satellite to study the sun. I have with me a well-known solar scientist or solar physicist, Dr. Dipankar Banerjee. He's the director of ISRO's Indian Institute of Space Technology in Thiruvananthapuram and a well-known astrophysicist. Thanks a lot for speaking to me.
My pleasure.
What is this satellite which the Polar Satellite Launch Vehicle will launch from Sriharikota?
It's a very unique experiment. They're going to do a formation flight. So it means, it's a twin satellite. The first satellite will carry a payload which will actually block the solar disk. Normally, if you want to do imaging of the solar corona, either you have to wait for the total solar eclipse when the moon blocks the solar disk and you see the beautiful corona. Otherwise, you can also go to space and build an artificial instrument called a coronagraph, which is there actually in Aditya L1.
Aditya has that, correct.
So Aditya L1, the major payload is called the visible emission line coronagraph, which is artificially blocking the solar disk and trying to image the solar corona. Here, the first satellite will behave like a moon and it will block the solar disk, and the second satellite will image the solar corona. So it's a very, very unique way, but to maintain the separation of these two satellites and accurately position them in space is a huge task.
Thank you for investing your time in watching this edition of The World 24/7. As always, we'll keep tracking the latest updates for you. Do stay tuned.